Today I'd like to speak on a topic that came up during the feast this year, at this location at least, maybe not everywhere. And my goal in speaking is not to give any kind of definitive answer. It's not a "thus saith the Lord," but rather I'd like to provide a few points to ponder, things to consider as we discuss this topic. And the topic is military service and war. Military service and war. So I guess in that sense it's not going to be a traditional sermon necessarily. Speaking about the military can become, like almost everything nowadays it seems, controversial, at least in some quarters. And as I reflected on this topic, I thought about the fact that sometimes we don't stop to consider and realize how much military thinking has imbued civil society. It's for a long time now, it's not something recent, including churches. For example, phrases such as command and control. They come out of the military. Command structure. Another one that's very commonly used, follow the chain of command. How many of you have heard that expression? Follow the chain of command, right? Quite outside of the military. And sometimes I've heard that in school settings. I work in education, as many of you know, and I've thought to myself, if you are in the military, and certainly if you are facing enemy gunfire, the officers need to be able to give commands, and the people need to follow those commands immediately, and you can't have any kind of discussion or back and forth. But working in a school is not quite the same thing. So maybe some of these structures that we've taken over, if you will, from military thinking don't necessarily apply in other settings. Another expression that you've probably heard a lot that comes out of the military is above my pay grade. How many have heard that expression? Yeah, because a lot of times, of course, in the military, depending on your rank and your pay, then you have more authority and more knowledge and so on and so forth. So we use all of this stuff that comes out of the military. Now, before I continue, maybe I could share a little personal background, at least family background. My father fought in World War II. He was in the Pacific Theater fighting against the Japanese. In fact, I remember as a child, he'd been given this Japanese sword. So we had that at home with a letter and a plaque, and it was somewhere there in the house. And I honestly, after he died, I don't know what happened to it. I kind of wish I still had it, but I remember that was one of the items that he obtained after his service in the war, in World War II. I also had a great uncle Ernest. Obviously, I never knew him, but he fought and died in World War I. And of course, in just over a week, November 11th, will mark the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, November 11, 1918. And I imagine we'll be thinking about that, at least some people will be thinking about that, commemorating that very bloody event, which eventually led to World War II. So certainly I very much appreciate, and I think we all should deeply appreciate all who dedicate their lives to serving others, especially those who are willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice. And that, I guess, would also include, by extension, first responders, people such as police and firefighters and so on. Now, thankfully, not all people in the military, not even all career military, have had to face war. There have been periods of relative peace, and even during wars, individuals have had desk jobs or others that didn't require actual fighting. And that also applies in areas such as policing. I remember one church that I pastored many years ago, one of the members that I relied on for many, many things was a career police officer. And he'd been in the police for all his working life, and he continued in the police after he came into the church. And in his situation, he actually had a desk job, so he didn't have to be armed during the day, but he had to keep a gun available. So his gun was, he told me, I keep it in my office drawer. So if there's inspection, I have it right there. And he had, I think, just a few years to go before he would be eligible for retirement. And certainly, as I said, in the church, I came to rely on him for many things because he was very much someone who got things done and was very effective. Traditionally, of course, as I'm sure most of you know, if you've been around the Church of God for any length of time, pacifism was the traditional position of the Church of God. Now, pacifism has had a controversial history in the United States, despite the fact that, for example, Quakers, going back to the early colonial period, were established as pacifists who did not believe in warfare. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on historical events, but just alluding to some of them. Mentioned the Civil War. Years ago, I did a study on what did you do if you were a pacifist during the Civil War. And in many cases, you could actually pay someone to fight for you. So if you didn't want to do the fighting, you could pay somebody else to do the fighting. Now, for a lot of true pacifists who did not believe in killing, that was a problem because they thought, well, look, I don't want to go out and kill, but it's not because I'm a coward, it's because I don't believe in killing. So I don't feel I can, in good conscience, pay somebody else to do what I don't want to do. So then they would refuse to do that. And of course, some of them ended up being jailed as a result. Lincoln was very understanding of their position, and I think he was a great man in that respect, and many other respects too. But he was able to understand, even though, of course, he knew he needed an army to fight, still he was understanding of the position of those who were sincere pacifists. Some of you may have seen a movie that came out, a couple of years ago, I think it was, Hacksaw Ridge. It was the story of a Seventh-day Adventist during World War II. And he was an American pacifist who refused to carry a weapon. You think, how can you do that? You're in the Army. He actually volunteered to join the Army because he felt he needed to, but he refused to carry or use a weapon or firearm of any kind. And of course, initially during training, he's called a coward. The other soldiers really believe that that's what he is, but he ends up showing that that's the last thing he is. He is not a coward. He just believes very powerfully in not killing, in pacifism. Now, of course, this sometimes gets to the issue of how people define words. As I said, some people would view pacifists as cowards. Could that be true in some cases? Undoubtedly, but I don't think that's any more true than it is of the general population. In any given population, you're going to have people who are brave, and then people who are courageous, and then people who are not so brave and not so courageous. I think that's true in all populations. So we have to be sometimes aware of that and be careful with that. Also the term patriot, what does it mean to be a patriot? Again, I don't want to get off on some discussion there, but sometimes we can define it in such a way that it requires people to violate pacifist convictions if those are their genuine convictions. So you have to be aware of the fact that definitions are sometimes arbitrary. I would use the example of the definition of Christian. In the world at large, in general, many individuals would require belief in a triune God, in the Trinity. Otherwise, you're not a Christian. Of course, my reaction to that is who gave some people the right to insist that their definition is the correct one, or the best one, or the only one? Clearly, people might say, well, more of us believe this than believe something different, and that may be true, but is the majority always right? I mean, I think most of us would say no. So we have to be aware of how words can be defined, and we can be promoters of liberty, defenders of liberty, even if we are not in the military or even if we support pacifism. Clearly there are in the military and have been many brave, many selfless, many heroic people. One of the individuals who comes to my mind when I think of that is a man named Pat Tillman. Some of you may remember Pat Tillman, who was a football player in the NFL. And as a result of 9/11, he decided to join up. He enlisted in the Army the following year, in 2002, and served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Tragically, he was killed. And there was a lot of confusion about how exactly he died. Turned out he'd been killed by friendly fire, which obviously compounds the tragedy. But apparently the Department of Defense delayed disclosing that information for fear. Well, I guess their goal was to protect the image of the military, because it doesn't look good if you tell people, well, it was friendly fire that killed him. And he was viewed, I think, by many as a national hero because he'd given up so much in terms of his professional opportunities and so on. But, even as we consider individuals who are truly brave, truly courageous, truly willing to give up much, including their lives, are all people in the military truly like that? Are they all truly exemplary? I think if we think about it, we consider it, that's not the case. I was looking at some research as I prepared this message, and again, this is not to attack or criticize anybody, but one study showed that 8% of prison inmates, 8%, that's a small percentage, relatively speaking, of prison inmates were veterans. 8% of the people in prison are veterans, which is roughly comparable to the percentage of veterans in the general population, 7% according to the Pew Research Center. So that, to me, would suggest that military people represent a cross-section of the general population. They're just like everybody else. And as with any population, you have good, not so good, bad. So you have that cross-section in the military. And I say that because sometimes, and sociologists have tried to understand why this happens, but sometimes there could be the risk of excessive praise or almost idol worship of the military. We sort of kind of put people up on a pedestal, and sociologists argue it's because so few people join the Army that to compensate for the fact that I'm not willing to do that, I'm going to put these people up on a pedestal and kind of idolize them. And the reality is people in the military are just like the general population. And I think of one scripture as I say that. The scripture, and you don't need to turn there because you're all familiar with it, is in Matthew 19, verse 17. When Jesus, in responding to a comment, says, there is no one good but one. There's only one being who is perfect. Paul says in Romans 3 that all have sinned, all have fallen short. Because the reality is all human beings are fallible. All human institutions are too. That includes churches, not just the military. And there is no one who does not make mistakes. There's no one who has never done evil whatsoever in his or her life. We all are fallible human beings. And the other thing that we have to realize and understand is that conflict, which of course is the basis of warfare, conflict is the default condition of mankind. Conflict is the default condition of mankind. We just, as human beings, do not know how to live at peace. And sometimes we'll look at the younger generation. Of course, I work with young people. I work with teenagers. And I'll be honest with you, as I look, I have whatever number that I teach. I like them. Now, that doesn't mean they're perfect. Some I really would wish they'd work harder. But, I think they're nice kids. And you hope for a great future for all of them. But at the same time, sometimes in the back of my mind is the thought, well, some of them may turn out not to be as honest, as upright as one would wish, as they themselves, as their families would wish, for whatever reason. And ultimately, of course, how many of us here, now most of us here are, in I shouldn't say the retirement center, but, in that retirement cohort, because I think my daughter, when I told her I was going to speak on this, she said, military service and war, you guys aren't eligible for military service and war. I said, I know that, but, we will sometimes talk to whether it's children or grandchildren or other young people. So I thought it's still valuable. But, when you think ahead 20 years, 30 years into the future, when these teenagers of today will be the adults who are running things tomorrow, will we live in a world that's at peace? How many of you, I don't want anyone to raise their hands, but how many of you think that? I certainly don't. And it's because human beings just do not know how to live in peace. So conflict is perennial. As I said, it's the default condition of mankind. In fact, let's go to Genesis 6. We were referencing Noah in the Bible study, but let's go to Genesis 6. You see, from the very beginning, from the time of Adam and Eve, there's conflict. First of all, there's conflict with God. There's disobedience. Adam and Eve disobeyed. So that's conflict right there. And then conflict within the human family, the first human family, the first two siblings, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. So from the start, there's conflict. And then if you go to Genesis 6, sometimes we've perhaps overlooked this, sometimes we haven't, but here in Genesis 6, in terms of why the flood, why did God make that decision to destroy most of mankind and start over, if you will? Well, let's look here at verse 11, Genesis 6 and verse 11. We read that God saw that the world was corrupt and full of violence. The world was corrupt and full of violence. And when has the world, since the flood, not been filled with violence? I mean, Mr. Haber was talking about the tragic events of last week in Pittsburgh. Violence. And we can go through, and I'm sure we could just spend a long time going through event after event that reflects violence today. But the world of that day, of Noah's day, was filled with violence. And some theologians have argued there was so much bloodshed because of this violence that, in effect, the flood was required to wash away this blood, to renew the earth, in effect, because of all this violence. And what happened right after the flood? Genesis 9. God tells Noah to be fruitful and multiply. Clearly, you're going to have to refill the earth. But what is the very first warning that God gives to Noah right after the flood? Okay, there are no other human beings present, just this family. Noah's been selected because he's exemplary. He is not part of the violence. He's not part of the killing. He's not part of the bloodshed. Presumably, neither are his sons or their wives. And yet, God knows what the default condition of mankind is. And that's conflict. So he tells them in Genesis 9, let's start reading in verse 5. And further, for your lifeblood I shall demand satisfaction. From every animal I shall require it, and from human beings also I shall require satisfaction for the death of their fellows. Verse 6, anyone who sheds human blood, for that human being his blood will be shed, because in the image of God has God made human beings. And so God says if someone kills someone, that person will have to pay for that bloodshed with his life. So from the start, God is already anticipating that this is going to happen. He's not going to put in a warning there or a prohibition with consequences if that would never happen. Last thing that could occur. No, that's very likely to happen. And of course, as we read the rest of the Bible, we see that. So because conflict is the default condition of mankind, that's why scriptures such as the one in Isaiah 9, and let's just turn there. This was one that I'm sure we all read during the feast. Isaiah 9, verses 6 and 7. Isaiah 9, 6 and 7. For a child has been born to us, a son is given to us. He will bear the symbol of dominion on his shoulder, and his title will be Wonderful Counselor, Mighty Hero, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There is someone coming who is going to bring peace. His coming is going to be so completely revolutionary that we will no longer have conflict. That will no longer be the default condition of mankind. It will be a transformative event. Verse 7, wide will be the dominion and boundless the peace, endless the peace, bestowed on David's throne and on his kingdom to establish and support it with justice and righteousness from now on forevermore. And so his government of the increase, I think it says in the King James, of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. And we view this as Christians as a prophecy about Christ and what Christ has come to do for us in our own lives, personal lives, and for the world. So we have been called as Christians to be followers of the Prince of Peace, to be ones who look forward to a time when peace will flow throughout the earth. Now, if we go back to the Old Testament, who were God's chosen people? I mean, we can go back, say, to Abraham, after Noah, some generations, and then eventually we get to the Israelites, who are God's chosen people. And then later on, it ends up being the tribe of Judah primarily, with a few others from the different tribes. And certainly at times, during much of the period that the Old Testament covers, God did direct their armies in their fighting. There is no comment during those events about pacifism, but it's very clear from the biblical record that God is directing those armies, particularly in certain key events, as we'll allude to a couple a little later. But after the time that the last book in the Old Testament is written, in the 400s BC, around the time of Malachi and Nehemiah, around that period, after that we don't see claims that God is directing armies. We don't see those claims. Later, of course, we have the Maccabees. Now, the Maccabees are not in most versions of the Bible. They're considered apocryphal or deuterocanonical. Now, the Maccabees, of course, starting the 2nd century BC, late 2nd century BC, on into the early part of the 1st century BC, they believed that God was with them, blessing their efforts. And I'm not here to say he wasn't. But in terms of, thus saith the Lord, that's a question of personal viewpoint. So they believe that God is with them, but their claim is not viewed by all Christians as divinely inspired. It's much the same, in the same way that you and I might say, well, I think God blessed me by giving me this job. I may believe that sincerely, and it may be the case. But can I prove it to everybody that that is the case? No, I can't. That's my personal belief. And certainly we do see in John 10 a reference to the Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah, and Jesus is at Jerusalem at that time. Now, he makes no particular comment regarding that, but certainly the Maccabean armies, or the armies of the Maccabees, felt that God was blessing their efforts. So as we look at the Old Testament, if we go back to Genesis, we don't need to turn there, but in Genesis 14, if you want to look at it later, Genesis 14, you may recall, Lot was taken when some armies attacked Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot is taken with his family and his goods, and so Abraham is told this and decides to go rescue his nephew. And so he pursues 4 kings with 318 armed men, it tells us, to recover Lot and his goods and his people. By the way, this was, Lot was staying in Sodom. I was just, as I was reading about this, I was picturing a political ad today, for some reason. I guess it's because I've been getting a lot of mail recently. Probably some of you have too, but, vote for so-and-so. I could just picture good guy, maybe in quotes, good guy Abraham supports Sodom and Gomorrah. Are you going to vote for him? Are you going to vote for Abraham? He supports Sodom and Gomorrah. Can you believe that? Of course, in this particular case, he was, but he was doing that to rescue his nephew. But think about Abraham's situation. He's got 318 armed servants. They go and recover everything. Does his situation apply to us today? Does God speak to us directly? Okay, what about other things in Abraham's life? Abraham had a son by his wife's maidservant. Right? Now, of course, today most wives don't have a maid to take care of them. But if you did, if you had someone taking care of things in the house, how many wives would say, hey, I can't have a child. It's okay. Why don't you have a child with the maid? We would probably think, no, that doesn't apply to us as Christians. That would not be acceptable. Okay, let's look forward to the time that the Israelites leave Egypt and enter the promised land. Let's go to Joshua 6. Joshua 6. And of course, we see God very much involved in everything that is going on here. But let's just start reading in Joshua 6 and verse 1. Tells us that Jericho was bolted and barred against the Israelites. No one could go out or in. And the Lord said to Joshua, this is a direct instruction, command from the Lord. Now, think about armies today. How many armies could legitimately say, God said to the leader of the army, the commander-in-chief? And I don't think any could say that today. The Lord said to Joshua, see, I am delivering Jericho, its king and his warriors, into your hands. You are to march around the city with all your fighting men, making the circuit of it once a day for 6 days. And he tells about blowing the trumpets on the seventh day. And at the blast, verse 5 of the ram's horns, when you hear the trumpet sound, the whole army must raise a great shout. The city wall will collapse, the army will advance, every man straight ahead. And if we go down, same chapter, to verse 21, it tells us that under the ban, they destroyed, this is the Israelite army, they destroyed everything there. They put everyone to the sword, men and women, young and old, as well as the cattle, the sheep, and the donkeys. So everything was under the ban and was completely destroyed, except for what Achan took, and the story of that is in the following chapter. Now, does that occur today? Does that kind of direct instruction that you are fighting God's battle with specific instructions about what to do, does that happen today? No, it doesn't. Later on, we get to the point of kings being established in Israel. Let's go to 1 Samuel 8. 1 Samuel 8. And starting in verse 6. Now, this is when the people demand a king. They want to be like other nations because they're not happy with having prophets and some of these the sons of the prophets not being, in their judgment, wise or just. So they asked for a king. So in 1 Samuel 8, we start reading in verse 6, their request for a king displeased Samuel. And the Lord told him, listen to the people, all that they're saying. They have not rejected you. It is I whom they have rejected. I whom they will not have to be their king. So in rejecting God as their king, of course, they're deciding to do things on their own under the leadership of the king, but not necessarily as close or as directly connected with God as before. And so he says to them in verse 9, hear what they have to say now, but give them a solemn warning and tell them what sort of king will rule them. And so he does that. And then verse 11, he says, this is Samuel speaking, this will be the sort of king who will bear rule over you. He will take your sons and make them serve in his chariots and with his cavalry, and they will run before his chariot. Some he will appoint officers over units of 1,000 and units of 50. Others will plow his fields, reap his harvest. Others again will make weapons of war and equipment for the chariots, and on it goes. So this king is going to have people serving in the military having to do what the king requires. not necessarily what God requires, but what the king demands and requires. And so Samuel is giving this warning to the people, but they reject the warning. They still want a king. They insist on having a king. And so God gives them a king. And then almost immediately, we see that the first king, Saul, goes astray. But interestingly, one of the things that he disobeys on has to do with a direct command from God through the prophet. So let's go to 1 Samuel 15. 1 Samuel 15, start reading in verse 1. Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now listen to the voice of the Lord." So this is God speaking directly. Again, this is not a situation that exists today. We have no military. I don't think even the Iranians would claim that, they have the supreme leader. Would the supreme leader say, hey, Allah is speaking to them? No. So no army in the world claims that God is speaking to them directly. So listen to the voice of the Lord. This is the very word of the Lord of hosts. I shall punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they opposed them on their way up from Egypt. Go now, fall upon the Amalekites, destroy them, and put their property under ban. Spare no one. Put them all to death, men and women, children and babes in arms, herds and flocks, camels and donkeys, everyone. And so this is a direct instruction here from God through Samuel to Saul, which Saul disregards, which eventually ends with his dynasty being ended. And then, of course, we have David who killed Goliath. But let's go to 2 Chronicles 22. How did God view all this bloodshed, all this military bloodshed? 2 Chronicles 22, we read what David tells his son, starting in verse 7. Well, I'll start in verse 6. David sent for Solomon his son and charged him with building a house for the Lord, the God of Israel. "Solomon, my son," he said, "it was my intention to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, but the Lord forbade me and said, 'You have shed much blood in my sight and waged great wars. And for this reason you are not to build a house for my name.'" So this seems to suggest that this killing was not something that God really was in favor of, other than for particular reasons that I think we can understand in many cases, maybe not in all cases. And so for this reason you are not to build a house for my name, but you will have a son who will be a man of peace. Shlomo, Solomon, man of peace. His name meant peace. "And I shall give him peace from all his enemies on every side. His name will be Solomon, man of peace. And I shall grant peace and quiet to Israel in his days. And it is he who will build a house for my name. He will be my son, and I shall be a father to him. And I shall establish his royal throne over Israel forever." And this has echoes of what we read in Isaiah 9. So Shlomo in some ways represented what Jesus Christ will do in the future. And then after Solomon, his son Rehoboam, because of his foolish reply to the people, ends up dividing the kingdom. So now the kingdom has two parts to it: the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, and then the southern kingdom, which is Judah. And so let's go to 1 Kings 12 and see what Rehoboam's reaction to that was. The kingdom is now split. There's a divide in the kingdom. What do you do? His first inclination was to fight, to reunite the kingdom. So in 1 Kings 12, we start reading in verse 21. When Rehoboam reached Jerusalem, he mustered the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, 180,000 chosen warriors, to fight against Israel and recover his kingdom. So his decision as king was, we're going to war, we're going to fight, and we're going to recover the kingdom. They're going to come back to us. But this word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, say to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all Judah and Benjamin, the rest of the people, this is the word of the Lord. You are not to go up to make war on your kinsmen, the Israelites. Return to your homes, for this is my doing. Now again, today, if someone decides to go to war, some general or some commander or commander-in-chief, does he have a prophet going up to him and saying, no, you shouldn't do this? God says, don't do this. That does not occur. That occurred at this time, but not today. And yet, if you go to chapter 14 of 1 Kings, even though at this point they didn't fight, 1 Kings 14 and verse 30 tells us there was continual fighting between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. So even though they didn't go to a war at this point, apparently they still had at least skirmishes and other battles throughout. As I said, conflict is the default condition of mankind. And imagine now if you were in the military in the northern kingdom. You know, you happened to have been born in the north, so you didn't have a choice in that. And now, instead of Rehoboam being your king, Jeroboam is. And Jeroboam calls you, okay, you're in the army. You've got to go fight Judah. You know, if you're in the military, what choice do you have? You know, you have to do it. God was no longer with the northern kingdom. He was with Judah a little bit longer. Eventually, Judah is captured, and then, of course, we get to the time of the Maccabees. Now, what about the New Covenant? What happens in the New Testament? Well, the disciples expected the return of Christ very soon. I mean, all the indications are that they expected that to happen while some of them were still alive. Certainly John, I would assume, did, but he comes to the end of his life, writes down what we have now as the book of Revelation, closing it with a prayer for Jesus' soon return, but Jesus did not return at that time. But they expected Jesus' return very soon. So, Rome, of course, attacks and destroys Jerusalem in AD 70. Do you think any believers were in the army resisting Rome at that time? Thinking, hey, you know, I'm a patriotic Jew as well. Because at that time there wasn't so much the separation between Jews and Christians that we understand today, but Christianity was considered to be the full expression of Judaism, if you will. So was it possible for any believers to be fighting Rome in AD 70? I don't know, but I somehow don't think so, because let's go to Matthew 24 and look at what the instructions were to Jesus' followers from Jesus himself. Matthew 24 and verse 9. 24 verse 9. He's talking about, because they ask him, when will the end be, the end of the age, in verse 3. And so he tells them about some of these things, and wars and earthquakes and famines and so on. And verse 9, he says, you will then be handed over for punishment and execution. All nations will hate you for your allegiance to me. So this suggests that they're not fighting, they're not resisting, they're going to be handed over for punishment, maybe betrayed, and for execution. What about going down to verse 16? 15. When you see the abomination of desolation of which the prophet Daniel spoke, verse 16, then those who are in Judea must take to the hills. So here, the instruction is you must be ready to flee. It doesn't say you must be ready to fight. It says you must be ready to flee. How about verse 20? Pray that it may not be winter or a Sabbath when you have to make your escape. There will be a time of great distress, such as there has never been before since the beginning of the world and will never be again. So at no time, as you read Matthew 24, and the question was, what's it going to be like at the end? At no point does Jesus suggest, no, you are to be part of a military that is fighting against all these things that are happening that are going to affect you. You will, in fact, need to be fleeing as you are aware of certain signs. And in fact, he also makes a reference to the days of Noah later in the chapter, verses 37 through 39. And as it was in the days of Noah, well, what did we see earlier about the days of Noah? Full of violence. And people are totally unaware of what's happening until it's too late. So there's no indication there. Now, let's move to the 2nd century, to AD 135, the Bar Kokhba revolt, which led to the final destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Would some Christians have been taking part in that battle, fighting against Rome? Let's look forward to the 4th century, move forward, I should say. Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine. So now, presumably, Roman soldiers are Christians, and they fight against Rome's enemies. Was that God's will? Were they doing what God wanted them to do? Let me move forward a few centuries. I'll come back to the comment I was going to make later. Many centuries, about 1,000 years, in fact, to the 100 Years' War. 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, between England and France. England and France, two nominally Christian nations. So they both worship the Christian, or they follow the Christian religion. Let me just go to a scripture as we think about that in John 13. John 13. And verses 34 and 35. John 13, 34 and 35. I give you, he's talking to his followers, his disciples, a new commandment: love one another as I have loved you, so you are to love one another. If there is this love among you, then everyone will know that you are my disciples. And Jesus' love, this context, is one that means he lays down his life for them and for us. So Jesus says this is how people will know that you are Christians, in effect, because you love one another. All right? So you're a Christian in England, and the king says, come on, you're in the military now, you've got to fight France. You've got to fight Christians in France. How do you do that? How do you fight? And you're a French Christian, you've got to fight English Christians. Or later, the 30 Years' War, 1618 through 1648, which started originally as a war between Protestant and Catholic states. One of the results was the rise of the modern nation state. Or the English Civil War, that was in 1642 to 1651, which pitted the Roundheads against the Royalists, both groups believing and claiming to be Christian. Or let's think about the Revolutionary War. What if you were a British Christian sent to fight as a redcoat against maybe your cousin who happened to be an American? You're having to fight your Christian cousin. How would that work? You know, Abraham Lincoln, I think, probably had to think about that deeply during the American Civil War, because in his second inaugural, he said about the North and the South, he said, both read the same Bible. Both pray to the same God, and yet each invokes his aid against the other. You know, how does that work? You see, if we as a church are to have a position on military service, we must remember that there are Christians not only in the United States, there are Christians around the world. And so any position we took would have to be tenable in all countries, not just the United States. You see, if we advocate for military service in the U.S. and we extol the military in the U.S., fine. how do we respond to a Christian in a country such as, say, Venezuela? There are Christians there too. Should he follow the same position there? If he is called upon or required to join the military, or someone, we could name many other countries. And if not, why not? Or are we saying that only the U.S. military is God's military? Is that what we're saying? So we have to be consistent, because sometimes we forget that Christianity is not just a religion for Americans. It's a religion for the whole world. And so whatever policy we advocate has to be a policy that would be applicable around the world. It has to be something that the church worldwide can do. And, the other thought is in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 21. Because if you do join the military, of course, you have no freedom there to select a day of rest, or you can't select which wars you fight in and which wars you don't fight in. You don't say, well, I think that's a just war, that one isn't. I'll fight that one, I won't fight the other. And so, in effect, you become a servant, or maybe some might use even the word slave, but certainly a servant. But let's look at verse 21 in 1 Corinthians 7, and I think this scripture would apply. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let that trouble you. Though, if a chance of freedom should come, by all means take it. So don't seek to be a slave. Don't seek to be a servant. Seek to be free. And then some, and this is the last point I wanted to comment on, some have talked about centurions in the New Testament. And we see the examples, some very, very fine examples of centurions. One who asked for the healing of his servant, asked Jesus, and the people in the community say, well, yeah, he's been very generous. He has given us donations for the building of synagogues and so on. And Jesus reported, Jesus said he marveled at his faith. And then, of course, Cornelius, who is also not just a centurion, but obviously these centurions were Gentiles. And by the way, a centurion was roughly equivalent in terms of today's rank system, a captain in the military. He'd be over perhaps 100 men, which is a centuria, 100. So that's why he was a centurion. You're over 100 men, which was a fraction of a legion. Well, I don't know. Sometimes when people say, well, if God called a centurion, then military service is fine. Well, think about it for a minute. What if a centurion were told, okay, you have to go arrest Christians and execute them? What would he do? I mean, it doesn't tell us, but you have to ask yourself, what would Cornelius have done had he received the order from his superiors? Okay, Cornelius, now your job is you go find some Christians, take them, interrogate, do whatever you have to get something out of them, and then execute. I mean, I'm not asking for a show of hands, but how many of you think that that's exactly what Cornelius would have done? He said, hey, I'm a military man, I follow orders, going to arrest them, going to kill them. What about John 13:34? Right. Again, it doesn't say, and at the time in Judea, thankfully there was not a whole lot. I mean, there was some. We just read about those whose sacrifice Pilate mingled with blood, executed them. So there was some. There was a centurion present at the crucifixion. But I dare say that if you are caught in this situation between being a Christian and following orders, you would have to make the choice to be a Christian. So it doesn't tell us how Cornelius' later career turned out, whether he left the army and did what. We don't know. I mean, any of that has to be, I guess, in the realm of speculation. And I had many more notes about centurions, but I've gone over time already, and I apologize for that. As I said at the beginning, my goal was certainly not to give any kind of definitive answer, and that was not, please don't take it as that. It's not a definitive answer to the question of military service and war. Ultimately, that's a question for the individual to decide. It's a question of personal conviction, personal conscience. But I do hope I was able to provide maybe a few points to ponder as people, well, maybe not us necessarily, might not affect us directly, but maybe children or grandchildren or other younger people who are friends, points to ponder as we think about and consider this important subject. And I hope, it certainly has done this for me, but I hope it made us yearn even more for God's kingdom of peace to come quickly, to echo John's prayer at the end of Revelation, even so come, Lord Jesus, and for the increase of his government and of peace